Thank you so much. Well, let's have a look at what happened on the Asian side of things. Markets on that particular front struggled for some direction, with the markets in Japan and mainland China closing flat for the day. The Hang Seng in Hong Kong up 0.2%, the Nikkei ending the day flat. When we look at what's happening on the European side of things, markets seem to be advancing as investors digest some of the comments coming through from the Fed Reserve officials, as well as incoming data. News out of there just about an hour ago, the Bank of England choosing to hold its policy steady, hinting at inflation concerns. So we'll talk about those inflation concerns, particularly as they relate to the United States with our market watcher. But when we look at the U.S. futures at this point, pointing to a higher open. But to get into all the themes and the developments playing out right now, we are joined by David Shapiro from SASFin. David, thank you so much for your time. Let's talk about the JSE at this particular point. How's it performing so far?
That's picking up a little bit. In fact, it's right across the board that we've seen steadier markets. We've had a couple of days of uncertainty where it's been very difficult to read the trend, particularly because of what's been happening on overseas markets. And yet, if we look, as you mentioned, in Europe, and if we look at the futures, it looks like America is going to continue its upward trend. The S&P, which is the main gauge that we use to watch American markets, going back into record territory. So despite all the discussion around inflation and the future direction of interest rates in the U.S., I think the markets confused have kind of brushed it aside. I think the big story impacting now is that President Biden looks like he's going to come to an arrangement, a deal with the Republicans for an infrastructure package around about, I think the number was something like $559 billion, which is a lot of money. So at least we're going in the right direction, and that seems to have steadied markets. That means more kind of stimulus coming into the market. So I think if you're going to go into interest rates and inflation, confusing. I don't think even the Fed knows which direction, because you'll see decisions on both sides, or views on both sides. So poor old pals in the middle, I think, must be totally confused.
So let's stay with that, because we started off Monday with a lot of news reports saying that investors were digesting the so-called surprisingly hawkish tilt from the Fed. From your perspective, was it surprisingly hawkish, or were you not surprised given the data?
Well, I wish I could comment in an intellectual way, but I mean, it's so difficult to try and understand it. Remember, we're talking about very small rises, which might happen at the end of 2022 or might happen in 2023. So it's some time away. And in any case, this is not Fed policy. This is just views of some of the people in the room. And as I try to say, is that those views are conflicting. You know, within the 12 governors, I think there are different views across or around the table. So it's very hard to gauge what the Fed as a whole is thinking. But I think we're going to have to play this literally month by month to understand where inflation's going, and also where interest rates will be against that. But I still think it's some time away before we have to express concerns, and that's what the markets are telling us at the moment. You know, I think they're over the hump, and the fact that we're in new highs in the US, I think just says, okay, we're going to put this aside for the meantime.
Yeah. So the past week locally on the JSE, we've seen some performance updates, trading updates from various companies. As, result season starts to sort of pick up a little bit more steam, say mid-July going into August, are there companies that you are looking forward to seeing from a financial perspective?
I think, Tash, what we have to look for is number one, the recovery, which we've seen in a number of businesses. Coming from a very low point last year. The point is whether these businesses can sustain themselves against the economic outlook here, which we're starting to get worried about because of the outbreak of COVID, the third outbreak, and what this might mean for consumer confidence and also for business spending. So that's the negative. The positive is with the infrastructure program and with things improving globally, you're likely to see commodity prices remain static. Oil prices now, although it does affect us from an inflation point of view, the fact that oil is going up, does suggest that there's increasing demand out there. And that's a good sign. So I think the economic activity globally is picking up. It means spending will take place, consumer spending will improve, and all of those are positive sides for a large portion of our market.
Yeah. I'm sure you've seen, the headlines around the so-called commodity super cycle. When you're sitting with your team at SASFIN and you're all discussing, say, in your morning meeting, what are the rest of the guys saying? I mean, is this the super cycle, or is there nothing really super about this cycle?
I wish we were sitting around, but all I do is look at blank faces on a screen at the moment. So, I think the general view is it's hard to decide whether it's a super cycle or not. I still believe it's an upward cycle. I was listening to Ivan Glasenberg, who's the CEO of Glencore, the outgoing CEO, and just listening to him point out that the Chinese, at some point, even though they're releasing stocks from their strategic reserves, somewhere along the line, they're going to have to replace that. And also that in areas like copper, to start new copper mines, you need a much higher price because of the difficulty of getting to them. So I think looking at what Biden's doing, and I think there are other economies that are going to increase their infrastructure spend, looking at that, and trying to project that forward, and looking at the oil price as well, I still think that we're going to have at least a decent cycle in commodity prices, if not a super cycle. The super cycle that we saw at the beginning of the century in the 2000s, and then also after the financial crisis. I think it might not be at that kind of level, but it's still going to be good enough to support mining here.
All right, David, thank you so much for your time. That is David Shapiro, who is the chairman, deputy chairman at SASFIN, taking us through the markets. We're going to take a quick